Hey folks, welcome back. Patrick from Portrayal, working on the 1943 Willys MB. And so today we're going to wire it up. As you can see, we've made some progress and the tub is mounted onto the frame and we are getting down to the short strokes, as I say. So today's going to be about wiring the Jeep. And I got to tell you, in all honesty, this is the second video of wiring, because the first one we did was complete chaos. And it's because I'd never done it before. And I, in the video, said, hey, come along, we're going to figure this out. But it got so chaotic and I made so many mistakes that I said, you know what, let's do this again and hopefully we can save you guys some of the mistakes that we made the first time. So let's get going. All right, guys, so step one of this is you got to get a wiring harness. And we're not going to cover this in this video, but as probably most of you know, there are a bunch of different wiring harnesses depending on whether you have a Ford or a Willys, whether it's early, it's late, whether it was suppression equipped, filtrettes, etc., etc., etc. And the information's not really centrally located in any one place, so probably the best source of information about this is going to be some of the guys who make wiring harnesses. I got this from Vintage Wiring Harness of Maine, back when it was Vintage Wiring Harness of Maine. They've relocated, but they're still in business, so they know this world really well. And some of the other Jeep suppliers sell different wiring harnesses depending on what you have, but you're going to have to make some decisions about that. My Jeep is a mid-1943 Willys MB, and I am going to install the filtrette, but I am not wiring it for the filtrette because I don't intend to use those radios. If I don't even have a radio, but if we do put a radio in there, I'm not particularly worried about that interruption. So step one, you got to get the right wiring harness. So step two is you've got to get your firewall prepared. Now, one of the things I mentioned, we had a rodeo the first time, and part of that was because although I thought I had the firewall ready, I really didn't. So we need to get the firewall prepared, and you also have to decide whether or not you're putting on the firewall pad. And I did a bunch of research again, looking at all the Jeep books and looking online, and saw lots of different opinions. So I don't think anybody really knows how the sequence within which they installed the firewall pad. I went ahead and put the firewall pad on originally and installed it, and then come to find out that there were other things that needed to go on to the dash and the firewall pad was in the way. So I thought the firewall pad would have fit up flush against the firewall. It actually doesn't. There are bunches of bolts and nuts that have come through. So as an example, the horn gets installed, and those are 3/4 inch 5/16 bolts that come through, and they're protruding in the back. So obviously, and there are no holes in the firewall pad. So when you put the firewall pad up against those, you're going to end up having a little bit of a standoff. So that was a little confusing to me. There are a number of other places that it goes through, including the terminal blocks where you mount a lot of the wiring. So I'm going to go through real quick. We're going to walk through exactly what we've mounted onto the firewall. Again, the reason this all matters is because if you're going to use the firewall pad, the wiring harness itself goes through that firewall pad in multiple places. So let me show you what we've installed onto the firewall right now, and then we're going to talk about going ahead and we'll put the firewall pad on loosely because we may have to go back and mount more things, and we'll start threading wires through. So the heart of the Jeep wiring is really this 6-post terminal block. So again, going back to the firewall pad, it's held on by 1032 or 1024 screws, and those 1024 screws fit between the firewall pad and the firewall. So you've got to install this first. So I installed this first. As you're also going to lose access to install the horn mount right here, and you're going to lose access to install the oil can holder as well. And there are a bunch of other things that go on here. So there's a wiring clip that goes on here, and we're going to have to deal with all this. So going back to how they did this, those things all go between the firewall pad and the firewall. So what we're going to end up doing here is I've got the firewall pad loosely put in there. We're going to put a couple screws in it, and we'll feed wires through. Then we'll take those screws back out, some of the mounting places, and pull it apart a little bit. It's really kind of rough on the firewall pad, but I don't know of a better way to do it. So that's what we're going to do. So in the center of the Jeep and on the passenger side, we also have this 2-terminal block. Now that block is there for the filtrette, And in my case, the filtrette is not going to be there, but we're still going to mount it, and there's some extra wires coming through to make it look like it's actually installed. So we'll get to that in a second. This is a Type 1 ACM tub. There are studs to which that little terminal block is mounted. And in my case, the studs were missing, so I actually reinstalled them yesterday using a spot welder to kind of replace the studs. And they came out pretty good. They're a little beat up looking on the inside, but they work fine. I think the Fords have captive nuts. I think the Type 2 ACM tubs have different. So there's a bunch of differences there. You may or may not mount yours the way we did here. So part of the reason that we goofed this up the first time, or I should say part of the reason I goofed this up the first time, was because I really just didn't understand. And there's a lot of chaos when you start looking at wiring diagrams about what's going on. So let's try to make this really simple. The heart of the Jeep wiring system is really the light switch, okay? And that's where most of the complexity lies. If you think about it, you've got the main harness, which is essentially dealing with the light switch. And then you've got a couple of sub-harnesses that are dealing with different parts of the electrical system. So we're going to break this down. We're going to start off with the light switch and get the light switch wired up. And then we're going to go to the rest of those systems. But I think it's a lot easier way to think about it than you're not trying to master 7 things at once. All right, so the heart of the Jeep wiring system is this 4-position switch that deals with blackout lights and every other light that's on the vehicle. And there are a couple of different styles. So I'm not sure that this was installed on a World War II Jeep. Dodge has used the same switch, and there are some other vehicles in World War II that used them as well. But they all basically work the same. They've got a little fuse in the back here, and again, they're 4-position. The main thing that you've got to do is look and find their markings. And if you look in this particular switch, the markings are stamped on the side. And those markings are going to correspond with your wiring diagram. So you need to figure out where they are. And again, when you look at the actual wiring diagrams, some of the post configurations are different than what you see, like this switch, which may mean that this wasn't a World War II Jeep switch, or it just means that the one, there were different manufacturers and people moved it around. But they will work the same. Just make sure that you understand what the labels are for each of these terminals. And just to show you a difference, this is a switch that came off of, for sure, a World War II Jeep, and it's actually got, they're printed, all the labels are printed on the side. So again, who knows when, where. This one looks much closer to the picture in the TM9803. So this is probably, again, we believe this is actually an original one from a Jeep. This one, again, may have come from a Dodge. The other thing worth mentioning is that later Jeeps, so this style switch was used, I think, through 43, and at some point they switched over to a rotary switch. So I'm gonna, we'll put a picture in here just a second, and I'll show you a picture of a rotary switch. I don't have one here, but same issue. You've got their markings and labels on all the posts, so you're gonna just have to follow that along. And it's again, we're talking about a second, there were keys used in early World War II Jeeps on the slack rails, and very early, and then they switched to a toggle switch. So like I said, part of this process is picking your date, and if you're trying to get a factory class restoration, then you're going to have to figure out whether or not it was equipped with a switch or a key. And again, there are lots and lots of little differences, metal knobs on some early vehicles, plastic knobs on some later ones, rotary switches. And again, that's not the point of this particular video. We're just trying to get it wired up. And but if you are trying to do a factory class restoration or trying to keep it as close as possible to original, you're going to need to do a bunch of research to figure out which switches and knobs and keys versus switches, etc., etc. Okay, so we're going to work now. This is sort of step 3, I guess. This is the main wiring harness. And you need to start off with a wiring diagram. Now, we sell the complete World War II military Jeep manual, which my nice and trusty shop-worn copy here. has a wiring diagram in it. But again, this is a wiring diagram that was a snapshot in time and really doesn't deal with any of the changes that I was talking about before and the variations between Ford and Willys and suppressed and not. So hopefully when you buy your wiring harness from one of the major vendors, they're going to give you an instruction manual. And I got to say the instruction manuals vary in quality. One of the best sources for some of this information is the granddaddy of all Jeep books, which is All American Wonder. And volume 1 has a whole bunch of information on this. This particular schematic is in, part of this is in All American Wonder volume 1, and they sold this as a poster, and I just happen to have one. So it's very useful to see. I also got an instruction manual that came with my vintage wiring harness of Maine wiring harness. And we have a couple of other ones as well. One of my buddies is here who's done this a number of times to sort of guide us and make sure we don't mess it up. So again, more resources is better. But we're going to break this down. We're going to start off the main wiring harness. Step 1 of this is going to be get this main switch wired up. And we're not going to tighten any of the posts tight because other connections will probably be made to each of these terminal points, not all of them, but we're going to put them in. We're then going to pull the wiring harness from the inside compartment of the Jeep through the firewall and run it, okay? And again, there's a choice. A lot of people prefer to do it the other way. The only problem with that is that you end up having to lay, or you have to sit there and try to wire this inside the Jeep. It's a lot easier to do it on the bench like this, but with the firewall pad, you got to pull this through the firewall pad, and it's a little bit touch and go to do that. So there's kind of no easy way to do it. This is a way I did it the first time, and it worked out okay. So we're going to do the same thing again for the purposes of this video. So now that we've got this light switch wired up, and again, nothing's tight yet because we're going to have to take things off and add more connections to it. But next step of this is that I'm going to loosely attach the firewall pad to the firewall so that the holes line up, and then we're going to feed this main harness through. Now, you got to kind of, it's really a two-man job. It's kind of tough to do by yourself because there are places like you can see right here where you don't really want to try to yank that through. You're going to have to feed these through individually. So it's a two-man operation. Same thing true here. You're going to feed one of these through, and keep going. But let me get the firewall pad attached, and then we're going to feed the wiring harness through, and we'll at least temporarily install this switch and keep going from there. There's a really nice diagram, and I happen to have it on my phone here, a nice diagram in All American Wonder that shows what all the holes are for both Fords and for Willys. And again, there's some variations, so it's not the last reference you'll ever need, but it's pretty darn good. So what I'm trying to figure out now is where all the little screws go that hold the firewall pads in. And so I'm looking at this really quickly, and I've put one in already. We're going to put a second one in, and that'll hold it temporarily. This is a big mess of a connector. It goes back to the rear tail lights or stop lights. So this has got to go first, then we'll get this through, and then we've got one We're wiring up right now. We are plugging in the brake light. There's an actuator that goes on the front of the master cylinder, and we're plugging that in. And we're just looking at how to route it. I think there are a couple of options. One of them is, and that probably looks right there. And you can see over here, we're going to run it down. There's an original clip there, and I think we're going to put that there. And then this goes to that right there. So I'm assuming that's going to be the best way to do this.
So now we go in the back from there.
You might have heard that I was down with the blues, but I can't give you more reason news. I'm on the road. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The bad days are gone, and now I'm on the road. Yes, I am.
So this is just remnants of the original wiring harness. When I got this Jeep, it had a newer wiring harness, but they didn't bother to remove these clips. So these are the original clips in this original wiring harness, and it's nice because we will use them again. They were probably Parkerized. They look like they have a black finish on them, a black oxide finish, which is usually Parkerization on a lot of this World War II stuff. So I might clean them up a little bit, but we will reuse them. We got the light switch side, which we basically took care of. Now we're going to work on the other side. This is the passenger side, and this is really the power to make the motor run. That's how I like to think about this. So I went to great trouble here, if you look down here, to get this terminal block on. Now that terminal block is only used if you actually use your filtrette. So we wired it out. I spoke in the beginning and I thought that they had given us dummy wires to put in here, but they didn't. So we're not going to use the terminal block. It looks pretty and it looks like it's correct there, but it's not going to be hooked up. Yeah. Okay, so we're wrapping up part one. What we're going to do now is we've got panel light switch, we've got the blackout light switch that we can go ahead and wire and install, which will give us a feeling of huge success because we'll have instruments installed. And then next time we're going to come back, we'll put the circuit breakers in, we'll put the amp meter and a couple of the other instruments that fuel gauge, etc. Run the rest of those wires, mount the fenders up, and I'll have the fenders mounted before we do this because we're going to go through and tighten everything up beforehand. We can put the voltage regulator in there and wrap the rest of this thing up and get it going.
I'm on the road. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The bad days are gone, and now I'm on the road. Yes, I am.
We got the main wiring harness installed, and we got the main light switch installed. We got the blackout light switch and the panel light switch installed. We got the main engine stuff installed, and so really what's left to do is the whole front light section. So we got to wire some marker lights, we got to wire the headlights, and get all that stuff connected to the grille, which we can do individually. Then we need to get the fenders mounted so that we can put the little terminal strip there and hook those lights up, and also get the blackout light put on. And then on the other side, we got to get the voltage regulator on, and then we got to do the rear light, the rear lights as well. And the only other thing that I've got to do is I've got some rehab to do on all the instruments. We got to paint the bezels I'm using. We will separately set up and video the front light stuff, and we'll integrate that into the next video. So as always, thanks for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, share with your neighbors and friends who are Jeep enthusiasts. And if you got any questions, post them in the comment section below, and we love to hear from you. So keep those corners square and get your shop and make something.